Now, can we please welcome to the Bavard Bar stage our first Bavader of the evening, Phil Howells.
Thanks, Tim. Good evening, everyone. The only thing you need to know from the first slide is that, let me use the pointer. That is the USS Enterprise. That's what went off and did all the adventures. Most of the slides, I hope, are just entertaining and pictures. I use them as an aid memoir to just help me get through the thing. And that's not bad for a Salford lad, yeah? Aid memoir, that's good stuff. And I think it reminded me about being here tonight in a theatre. And just to prove that I'm actually from Eccles in Salford, I thought I would tell you about the 3 cinemas we have in Eccles, beginning with T. And that were Theatre Royal, Thodian and TheBT. Now, let's see if this works. Okay, I start off with my origins. And just say this, can I just check, how many of you know anything about Star Trek? Okay, just one. Okay, great. It doesn't actually matter whether you know anything at all or nothing. All will be explained in the next 20 minutes. And in fact, when I first got to talk with Tim, I thought, what can I do to tell you all about the great things about Star Trek? I thought, well, I could show every series, all the 8 or 9 films. And Tim said to me, you know, you've only got 20 minutes, Phil. So here we go. And first of all, my origins. I was born in Eccles in Salford, and in 1947, now I tell you that to give yourself like a background as to my learning in going through Star Trek. I lived in a council house with my mum and dad. They both had careers, except when I was born, my mother gave up her career and just went part-time. I went to a school about 50 yards up the road, and she made it her thing to look after me, to make lunch for me dad and myself, who walked from school and from work, and then to have the dinner ready when we came. And that was usual for the times in Salford. Men were the breadwinners, and women and mothers looked after the children and the families. And so that's the sort of like atmosphere I was brought up with in Salford. I will say later on when I was an adult, and I did speak with my mother, and said, you know, well, Mum, why did you why did you agree to that? And she said, well, it wasn't entirely that. She said, I did get some promises out of your dad. So I said, well, what were they? She said, well, I made him promise that when he brought his wages home, he'd put them on the table and he'd take his spends out, or I would give him his spends, and I'd take the rest for the housekeeping. And I told him that I wanted 3 holidays a year, and one of them had to be at Christmas, because there's absolutely no way I was going to be cooking at Christmas. And let me just go to 1970, my career. I'd worked for 5 years in the civil service, and I eventually went into social services in 1970 and worked for over 40 years. And now we go to the middle box. And I suppose I treat myself as a humanist. I was an only child, so I had a great life. But I was a bit of a rebel, and I tinkered about with communism. But the main thing was astronomy. Mr. Geary, our maths teacher at Eccles Grammar School, persuaded me to join the astronomy club. And that's really where I got my passion for stargazing and for space travel. So, my next thing is an invitation. I want you to take you back to the 12th of July, 1969. 6 o'clock, BBC. I'm in a flat, I've just left home, and I'm watching this. And just close your eyes for a moment, and here we go. Space, the final frontier. These are the voyages of the Starship Enterprise. Its 5-year mission to explore strange new worlds, to seek out new life and new civilizations, to boldly go where no one has gone before. It absolutely knocked me out. I just thought, this is my program. And just before we go into it, I just want to remind you a few things about the 60s. Most of the Western countries were involved in a Cold War with Russia. Native Americans were occupying Alcatraz on a regular basis, trying to get their rights about their property and the land that had been taken off them. Dr. Martin Luther King was leading the civil rights movement. And remember, there was about over 500,000 American GIs in Vietnam in a war far, far away. And the red circles, just to go, white male management teams were the norm in the 50s. If you saw any management team, they were always white males. And in the USA, interracial marriages weren't legal until 1969. And if you're a woman in Britain, then you couldn't take out a mortgage without a man acting as a guarantor. And that didn't change until 1974. And there we go, right. So I want to just take you into the creator of Star Trek, Gene Roddenberry. He was a TV director and a humanist himself. And he put Star Trek together, but he had a massive difficulty trying to sell this to the networks. He eventually sold it to NBC, and he used several strategies to get it accepted. First of all, to explore strange new worlds was in a paper that was written to support the setting up of NASA, the American space program. So he thought, let me get on the side of the White House, first of all. Then he used to describe Star Trek as wagon train to the stars. And it was really his, I suppose, a story of the Americans moving from the east of the coast to the west and moving into the unknown and exploration. But he also wanted to comment about some of the things that were going on and what he didn't like and what he did like. And he included tales of morality. And he used really good authors, such as Isaac Asimov. And his key stroke was to set it in the future, science fiction. So when he did present a program that was a little bit critical about what was going on in the States or somewhere in the world, he was always able to say, no, it's not real, it's science fiction. I'm not talking about what's happening right now. And that really helped him get it through. And his vision, brilliant vision, and this is really what appealed to me. He said Star Trek was an attempt to say that humanity will reach maturity and wisdom on the day that it begins not just to tolerate, but to take a special delight in differences in ideas and life forms. And that really struck me and has stayed with me for the rest of my life. So I'm going to take you now to the crew of the Starship Enterprise. Now for those Trekkies, who's this please? Captain James T. Kirk. And do you know what the T stood for? Well done, excellent. And this is? Bones, Dr. McCoy, well done. And Montgomery Scott, who was the engineer, Scotty. This one? Yeah, Pavel Chekhov. Here we go. Yeah, she was only known as number one. The actor who played her was Majel Barrett. This one here? Yes, Lieutenant Uhuru, who was communications. And here, Mr. Sulu. He was a scientist. And this one here, Mr. Spock with the large ears, who was the Vulcan. Now, this was Roddenberry's first ploy. When I first saw this picture at this setup, you've got to just remember, I was a child in the 50s and the 60s, and I lived in Salford, patriarchal society, certain goals, no one in senior teams other than white men. And when you're faced with this, you can see he was setting down a little card as to what he wanted to take forwards. And I just want to make a comment about Pavel Chekhov and say that he brought him in specifically to make his comment about the fact he didn't like the Cold War. And so Pavel Chekhov was Russian. He also had someone from Scotland. He had the black American woman. He had the alien, Vulcan. And he had Mr. Sulu, who was Japanese. And this was him saying, the best comes out of multi-ethnic teams. And I'd just like to take a couple of words about the two women. Majel Barrett just played in the first few series, and there was a bit of an argument about, and I think it was probably NBC, not wanting a woman as second in command. And they were really wanting Mr. Spock, the Vulcan. And in between times, Gene Roddenberry married Major Barrett, okay? And she actually said that the eventual choice to get rid of the woman, she said this: given that the choice between keeping Mr. Spock or the woman character, Gene kept the Vulcan and married the woman, because he didn't think that Mr. Spock would have had it the other way round. And I thought that was really quite a nice little comment there. Okay. Not only did it impact on me, but it impacted on a woman called Whoopi Goldberg, who was a child at the time of Star Trek, and when she saw the first episode, she ran to her mum saying, Mum, you've got to see this. There's a black woman on TV, and she isn't a maid. Because if you go back to the TV series at that time, the only place you found black women, they were either cooking or they were a maid in a white household. And in fact, she was so taken by the programme, she decided it gave her the courage to train and to become an actor herself. And she later on, she asked if she could join Star Trek. And they let her come in on The Next Generation. She played a 600-year-old alien called Guinan. And she dispensed philosophy and good advice behind the bar on the Starship Enterprise. Now, so, equality. Let me take you to this next one. My first, when I started in social services, I went back in '73 to Salford College. And to say I was surprised is probably putting it mildly. I went there, I was one of 5 men, 20 women on the course, and the course was run by a woman clinical psychologist. Now, for someone who, even in the civil service, never saw a woman manager above executive officer, this was quite a shock to me to sort of like go into this thing. And of course, we were all students. This was a group of women who were careerists, who knew what they wanted to do, and were out there making it happen for themselves. Within the first month, we used to go to the local pub, which was the Britannia pub. Now, the Britannia pub had a room which was called the Vault. And a vault up north is men only. And it had a sign on the door which said, no women or dogs allowed. And within the first month, a group of the women came to myself and one of my colleagues, male colleagues, and said, why are you putting up with this? You know, we need to do something about it. And they persuaded us to go down and talk to the landlord, and we eventually got the sign taken down, and the vault opened up. It was probably because he thought he might lose his custom from the college, but we took it that this was a real success for us. And, okay, so that's that. Balanced leadership team. Gene Roddenberry was really keen to show that this was not a white leader attaching a load of white men around him who all thought the same. If you look at the diagram, you've got Captain Kirk, who's courageous and vulnerable, McCoy, who was emotional, but was a confidant to Kirk. You've got Mr. Spock, who was logical, just the opposite of emotional, and was the critical alien, the one person who could criticise the human race, who could say, this is a view from outside the human race, this is what I see. Uhuru, knowledge of alien cultures and absolutely calm under fire. And Montgomery Scott, an absolutely expert engineer who could put into practice all the sort of like sayings of Captain Kirk. He wanted this and he wanted it by yesterday. So what you see is a team which is based on covering James T. Kirk's weaknesses. And together you see a team that covers every angle. And that's stood up with me again through my career. And to think of equality and diversity, you could go to no better place than 4 London boroughs where I worked over my 40-year period. Islington, Hackney, Waltham Forest and Lambeth. They were all mixed gender, diverse, multicultural teams and communities. And it was a real melting pot of cultures and new ideas. And I'll give you an example of my stay in Islington. I went to work as the head of the unit in Islington Children's Observation Assessment Centre. Now it sounds really grand, but it was a one-stop, it was really a last resort. Many of the children and young people who came to us had already had 4, 5, 6 placements that had broken down and came to us. And we had a mixed staff group of men, women, black and white. And so we developed two ways forward. The first way, inclusive teamwork. Because we were men and women, and we worked a shift. You worked 2 shifts and maybe a sleep in. And so the commitment we made was that we will try and work with these children, young people, by rewarding them for their good behaviour and keeping sanctions to a minimum. But what we said was, if you do have to sanction a child or a young person, you do it on your shift. You don't say, oh, well, you will do this tomorrow, or you'll have to stay in next week. You had to deal with it there and then, so that it didn't pass on to anyone else. And it also had to be a sanction that either a man or a woman, or whoever you were, could actually enact it, yeah, and not be undermined. The second one, do you remember when? This was really our belief in keeping good mental health, and that good mental health, for us as adults, is based on really good memories. Do you remember when we did this? And I remember during the winter months, we used to take maybe 10 or 12 children, young people, out in the van. We'd play this sort of like group hide and seek in Epping Forest, and come back in the dark, get to the kitchen and finish off with an egg butty before we went to bed. And it was really one of those examples of, do you remember when we did that, Phil, or whatever it was? And I just want to now move on to a prime directive in Star Trek. Now, the prime directive said this: no starship officer may interfere with the normal development of any alien life or society. Now, this was Gene Roddenberry. He actually put it in because LBJ, do you remember Lyndon Bird Johnson was the president? He was just about to send another 100,000 GIs to Vietnam. And that's specifically why Gene Roddenberry came up with this and placed it in the Star Trek series. It also, as he said, it guarded human beings from going to other planets and acting like gods. Yeah? And this was, again, something which I was able to bring into my work. In Hackney, children who were looked after were placed all over Essex. We had very few places in Hackney. Brentwood, Sackhoffen and Loughton, Thurrock. Well, I was very lucky to work there as a principal officer. We had a chair of social services who was a Sri Lankan, and I had my head of service was a Jamaican. And they really started to look at what we were doing with children and young people, particularly for black children and people who came in to live in Hackney. And what we did was, by placing them outside, we ripped them away from their friends, their family, their community, their school, and very often with foster carers or people they'd never met before. And so Hackney developed the policy of placing all Hackney children and young people within the borough boundary. And I spent probably about 18 months going around all the children's homes outside the borough, talking to every one of these children and young people individually to find out, this is happening, how can we best do this? Where do you want to be in Hackney? Is there anyone you want to live with, etc. And whilst we're still in Hackney, I'd just like to tell you this quick Hackney story about cultures and about different planets bashing up against one another. We appointed Simi, who had been born and was raised in South Africa. She was a black woman. Her and her family were heavily involved in the African National Congress, the ANC, which was headed up by Nelson Mandela. And her family had had to leave with her when she was in her early 20s and come to Britain, and they couldn't return because of the apartheid regime, what I call planet apartheid. Now, I was doing my stuff. I wasn't buying South African wine, and I wouldn't do this, and I wouldn't. But Simi told me this story, which really brought it home to me about how little I knew about other cultures. And she told me this story. She said when she was at university, a white student who she got on quite well with offered to give her a lift into university every day. And that happened for a week. And at the end of the week, this friend said, Simi, I'm getting a load of flack from my friends, from my colleagues. They don't really like you seeing you sitting in the front of the car with me, as though you're an equal. And he said, would you sit in the back? So I'm just going to ask you this question. What would you do? Sit in the back, refuse and sit in the front, decline the lift, or something else? Well, before I tell you what she did, I'll just tell you that within 2 days of her decision, she was back in the front seat. This is what she did. She sat in the back of the car, she made sure she had a newspaper, and she just made it look as though she was a really, really important boss who was being chauffeured to the university. And it just brought it home to me that as a white man in British culture, I would never ever, that story really hit me hard about the difference between cultures, and particularly cultures where some people are not seen as human, and how Simi dealt with it. It's excellent. Star Trek has something to say about inclusive decision making. All Starfleet officers had a duty to make their captain aware of alternative actions or solutions. This was really important, so it wasn't left to one person. If someone in the team said, not really sure about that, I think we should try an alternative. And in Waltham Forest, we agreed the same commitment in the management team there. I was then assistant director, and we just decided that if any of the management team said, not sure about this, I'd like to suggest something different, I'd say, put it on a side of A4, and I would guarantee we discussed it at the management team meeting before we made a decision. And I can tell you from my experience, it really led to really good quality decision making. And moving on to my last place, Lambeth. When I went to Lambeth in 2001, Lambeth I'd been through a horrible time for about the last 15 years. It was racked with child abuse inquiries into children who'd been abused, many in their own homes. And that was going on. Actually, the report only released its final report maybe about 12 months ago. It just went on forever. All the staff team, the senior staff team, had gone or had been sacked. And when I moved there, what we had to do, we had a really sort of like lacking in confident staff group within the social services. So we worked on Star Trek and 4 things to make it simple to keep them safe and to keep children and families safe. I mean, Star Trek, whenever they met someone they didn't know, someone new, they would say, hailing frequencies open. This simply meant, before we start firing and shooting, let's just listen to what they've got to say. Let's find out what they're doing here, and let's find out if they mean any harm. The second thing is, if you get a case referred to you, listen. The next thing you do, go and check the file. Have a look at the history. Talk to the professionals involved. It could be a GP, it could be a teacher, it could be someone in the police service, it could be a health visitor. Talk with them about the child, the parents, the family. Go and talk to neighbours. Talk to members of the family. And go down there and just check out and see what you can confirm. The third phrase from Star Trek was, beam me up, Scotty. And that really, what we said to the staff was, once you've got the information, you've been and visited the family and spoken with the child on their own, the next thing is, just come back to the office. Just talk it through with your boss. Or anyone, in fact. Just talk it through and say, this is what I think, and this is what I think we should do. And then if you go away and do it, someone's covering your back. You're not doing it on your own. And the last thing, set phasers to stun. Kirk was always keen that they shouldn't kill unnecessarily. I mean, he's quite prepared to kill, but he didn't want it to be an unnecessary kill. And the reason we put set phasers to stun was just to say, if you take any action, you may or may not make any difference. But what you can do, you can make sure that your interference doesn't cause more problems. So you're asking, am I a Trekkie? Oh, where's this come from? Oh, no. Just before we go on, I got the woman there, this is Tasha Yar. She was a security officer. She disappeared in a tar pit early on in the series. But I really loved the character. She was a really strong woman character. And she was played by Denise Crosby, who was Bing Crosby's granddaughter. Yeah. And I move on to the wider impact of Star Trek, and this is where I draw to a conclusion. Nichelle Nichols, who played Lieutenant Uhuru, she was the first black American woman in a position of authority on TV. That is absolutely clear. First on-screen interracial kiss between her and Captain Kirk. Now that wasn't the case in Britain. Anyone know where the first interracial kiss took place in Britain? It was Emergency Ward 10. Yeah. But this was quite something for the Americans. And in fact, there was such a furore about it that when they did the kiss, and NBC told them to take it out, William Shatner and Nichelle Nicole just found excuses as to why they couldn't get together. And what they did was they made it that this alien authority, which was like a god, was making them kiss to see what this was like. Finally, the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People, they were holding a charity do, and Nichelle Nichols was invited to go along. She went along and someone pulled her aside and said, "There's someone out there wants to see you, Nichelle." And she just thought it was a Star Trek fan. And she went out, and it was Dr. Martin Luther King, his wife and his 3 children. And she'd been thinking about leaving Star Trek because she didn't think it developed the character enough. And when she told Martin Luther King this, he said, "Nichelle," said, "my wife and my 3 children sit down to watch this program every week." He said, "You must not leave. You are modelling what we are fighting for." And so she stayed. And NASA also found the positive aspect of her role. And they took her and they kept her for 10 years to run a recruitment drive, during which time they appointed 8,000 women and people of colour to join NASA. Now, they didn't have the first woman in space, but Sally Ride was the first American woman, and Guy Bluford was the first black man to be in space. And that's really where I really just come to an end. I just want to make a comment from Guy Bluford. And Guy said this: "I chased my dreams. In the end, find what gets you excited, and chase it." Well, I'm pleased to say that I found Star Trek and my career in social services. I put the two together and I just had a brilliant time. And I hope you've enjoyed the talk tonight, and thank you.